With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on this Friday. It's great to be with you, as always, and there is a lot of local news to get to. But before we get into that, I did want to make mention of something because I like dealing with local people, and I just want to give a shout-out to the Chop Shop, which is here in downtown Montgomery. It's actually not far from my studio at all. You may notice that my beard has been trimmed and very nicely shaped, very well done. The guy there that does the beard shaping, very professional, and just did a fantastic job. So Caleb's Beard is officially brought to you by the Chop Shop. Just thought because he did such a good job that I would give a quick shout out for that. So if you do have some facial hair that you want managed, there's no better place in Montgomery to go than the Chop Shop right here in downtown Montgomery. So let's go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of what we've got today. Our top story is, of course, a local story because that always takes precedence here at Tactics. And unfortunately, this is one that I have to admit kind of flew under the radar for me. And keep in mind that I am somebody who this is my stock and trade. I'm right here in the capital city. I'm supposed to be able to keep my thumb on the pulse of these things. And I think that this is also a glowing testimonial to the fact that even someone that is very involved in the political process like myself and pays a lot of attention to it cannot be on top of everything all at once, which to me is a very big indication of the reason that our government has gotten too big. I think part of the advantage for lawmakers that want to seize and consolidate power is to have lots of bills and lots of balls in the air going at once so that even somebody that is trying to stay tuned in and focused on what is going on has a hard time keeping up with everything. And this is true not only of the citizens, it's also true of the legislature. It's also true of the people that are actually casting votes on this stuff. I mean, you think about, and this is a big glaring example, the omnibus spending package that went through that was thousands of pages long and they got maybe a day or two to look over it. Obamacare, the final version for that wasn't out until just about a day before they passed it. The gas tax. You'll remember that one of the big complaints, especially from some of the freshman lawmakers in our state house when it came to the new gas tax for the state, was we feel like this is being rammed down our throats. They've given us no time to read it. The final version of the bill came out less than 24 hours before the vote on it in the House, and they were expected to be good little soldiers and just pass it through. And of course, eventually that is what happened. But the point is in all this, there is a certain advantage to those who want to take advantage of the citizens and limit their power and limit their liberty in trying to keep as many things going at once. And I'm not trying to deflect from my own lack of keeping on top of this, because I hate that I somehow just missed this and I don't know exactly how that happened. But I did want to use that as an example of how even somebody that's trying really hard to stay on top of everything, I mean, this is my job. And I know most of you have jobs and families and things to concern yourselves with, and that's part of the reason that you watch this show in the first place, is because there are people like me that this is their career. And that you can't keep up with everything. Nobody can keep up with everything that is going on. So I try to parse through all of it and take the highlights and give you sort of what you need to know and try to condense it for you. That's sort of the service that I and other talk show hosts like myself try to do for you, whether it's on the local level, the state level, or some of the national guys that we have on News Radio 1440. So that's kind of the role here. But unfortunately, even somebody that it's their actual job, like me, to keep up with this, has a hard time doing that because of the sheer volume of information that is out there. And this is one that I'm really surprised that I didn't catch on to, because of how near and dear it is to my heart when it's dealing with gun rights. And we'll get into that in a second. By the way, a big thanks to a buddy of mine, Keith, who notified me about this. And I guess he had seen, because he does follow me on Facebook and social media platforms, he probably noticed that I hadn't been talking about this and was wondering why, knowing what a big gun advocate I am. And that's probably why he sensed that he needed to send it to me. So thank you to Keith for that. But it is important to remember that even somebody that's doing their dead level best to keep up with this has a hard time doing it because of the volume. And I think that this bill is no exception to that. I think that they really wanted this to fly under the radar and to not get a lot of press and not get a lot of publicity, because they know that this is going to be very unpopular in the state of Alabama if people put any thought into it. We're a very red state. We're a very pro-gun state. We really like our gun rights in the state of Alabama, and that's one of the reasons that I love this state, and I'm proud to be from the state of Alabama, is because of how seriously we do take our gun rights. But unfortunately, there are those in the state house that apparently want to at least greatly curtail your gun rights. Maybe not eliminate them completely, but this would certainly be a big, big step in the direction of getting rid of guns altogether. I'm not going to make a slippery slope argument here. I'm not saying that necessarily that is what this is going to lead to. But I am saying that this bill and the way that it is worded, and by the way, what we're talking about is House Bill 256, is rife. I mean, absolutely riddles with ways to be abused and to take advantage and disadvantage the gun owner in this situation. So to give you an understanding of exactly what this is, I want you to imagine a scenario. Imagine that you, as a citizen of the state of Alabama, imagine that you are a gun rights advocate, somebody that is conservative, and you take this very seriously and you talk about it. Maybe you're even an NRA member, or maybe you're the exact opposite. You're just somebody that happened to grow up in the state of Alabama. Because of that, you've gone hunting a few times and you have a couple of family heirlooms, maybe some guns that your granddaddy passed down to you. In either of these scenarios, imagine that you have, let's say, an uncle or maybe a cousin that happens to be very liberal and doesn't like the idea of private gun ownership at all. And because of this, they go to authorities knowing that you are a big Second Amendment advocate. Let's say maybe they're just upset with something that you posted on Facebook or Twitter. Let's just say it's something as benign as that. And not even threatening somebody, which, by the way, would actually be a crime. There are already laws on the books that deal with that. You can't threaten somebody's life in person, on the internet, whatever. That's a crime. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about maybe you just talked about how pro Second Amendment you were, or how you even just enjoy going out and shooting and blowing stuff up. That's something that you do as a hobby, that maybe you post pictures of yourself online using, for example, targets that are shaped like humans, which are very common in training. You can buy them at virtually any gun range. I know my gun range sells those. And that's specifically so that you can train yourself for self-defense. Well, let's say in this particular scenario, you have this family member that's very anti-Second Amendment, very anti-gun, and they see this. They go to a law enforcement official and say, hey, this guy is a danger. He's talking about guns all the time. He collects guns, and there's even these pictures of him shooting at human-shaped targets. And so we've got to do something about this guy. We've got to get his guns away from him, because I think he's making me uncomfortable, and I feel as though he could be a danger to himself or a danger to other people. Let's say that happens. And when that happens, armed men, police officers, let's say officers of ALEA, so state troopers, something of that nature, show up at your house, go through your house, find all the guns in your house, and take them away. Now, I know what you're thinking. Caleb, that's absolutely absurd. That could never happen in America. That's like something that would happen in the Weimar Republic or pre-Nazi Germany. That's like something that would happen in the Soviet Union or in North Korea. Yeah, but under this law, that would be perfectly legal. It would be perfectly legal. Let's change the scenario a little bit. Let's say, for example, that you're somebody that just lost his job and is going through a rough time. And you happen to have several guns in the house, has nothing to do with the scenario that you're in right now, but you just happen to be a gun owner. Let's say that you're really depressed and you go online asking for prayers, and let's say you even get a little bit angry or a little upset, and you talk about how you really hate your life and how depressed you are. And you're just kind of venting online because you're looking for some kind of outlet and you're kind of looking for somebody to listen to you. Well, under that scenario, a family member that sees that post could say, I know that this guy's got guns and he seems really depressed, so I think we need to go ahead and take his guns away because he's a danger to himself. Again, in this scenario, under this new law, if it passes, that would be perfectly legal. Men will show up to your house and take your guns. No due process, no trial. They show up, they take your guns from you. Let's take an even more extreme example. Let's say that you're a single mother, maybe a mother of 2, 3 kids, and you and your husband have been having problems. And you wind up separating for a little while. And the husband, who may not have actually been technically abusive physically, but is not necessarily what we would think of as a good husband and father or a good guy. Let's say that he knows that his wife, or maybe even former wife, has firearms at her disposal for her protection and the protection of her kids. Well, all he would have to do is make up a story and talk about how she threatened him or, something else of that nature, and convince some law enforcement official somewhere that she is a danger to herself or to other people. And then those same men come into her house and take her firearms. Now he knows that her house is firearm free. And so if he's enraged, he could come in, do some kind of harm to her, maybe even take it to the extreme or kill her or kill the kids, because he knows they're defenseless. He just watched, or at least heard about, armed men coming to her house and seizing the weapons that she kept for self-defense. Maybe he doesn't even go that far. Maybe he doesn't kill them, but maybe he kidnaps his kids and takes them somewhere else. And law enforcement has a hard time tracking them down. Maybe for years, this guy has this woman's children because she didn't have a gun in the house to defend herself because of this law. Those are real-world scenarios that would all be perfectly legal if this law were to take place. And that's why it is so incredibly dangerous. It is so incredibly wrong for this to go through. So let me give you a little description of what the bill says in the actual text of the law to give you an idea of why these scenarios would be legal. So House Bill 256 is known as what's called a red flag law. And what red flag laws do, and at least the intention behind it, is if there are individuals that they believe are disturbed or are going to be a danger to themselves or somebody else, the law enforcement would come in, seize the guns, and go ahead and do that immediately without any due process of law. And this particular bill would be no different. This law is sponsored by Representative Merica Coleman, a Democrat from Birmingham, which, by the way, not really living up to your name there, Merica. I mean, if your name was really Merica, you would think you would be very pro-gun, but apparently this Merica is not. But according to this bill, if any family member, school official, or law enforcement red flag somebody, in other words, they decide that that person should not be in possession of a firearm, then basically they take the guns first and ask questions later. Because if that were to take place, they go in and they seize your guns immediately and put them in storage. And then after 14 days, 2 weeks of not having your guns, Then you appear before a court, and you have to convince the court that you are allowed to have your guns back, that you are not a danger, and you having firearms is not dangerous to your person or to other people around you. That's the standard. And that's how this law would work. It would be perfectly legal to just confiscate somebody's guns, no evidence, nothing substantial to go on, no due process. They go in, they take the guns, and then 14 days later, you have to go to a court and prove to them why you're allowed to have your guns. That's the way that this burden of proof works, that you're the one, the responsibility falls on you to tell them why you're not a danger. And let's say that you're one of the lucky ones. Let's say that you are able to convince a court that you are not a danger to yourself or others and there's no reason for them to have your guns. Even if that's the case, you still have to undergo a thorough background check to get your guns back, and you also have to pay a storage fee. So even though there was an accusation and you didn't do anything wrong, you, the gun owner, not the person that complained and fallaciously said that you're a person that is dangerous and needs to have their guns confiscated, you, the gun owner, has to pay for storage of those firearms. I mean, this is one of the most insane bills I've ever read. I cannot believe that this is even being considered in the state of Alabama. The idea that the gun owner must go and prove to a court that he is allowed to have his constitutional rights is one of the most abhorrent things I've ever heard of. Think about this. Would we accept this with any other right? For example, I'm a member of the media. I know a lot of you aren't, but, I'm a member of the media. Let's say that somebody said, that Caleb guy, he says a lot of things that I don't like. So what they do is they pass a law that states that I'm not allowed to broadcast, violating freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Let's say that they pass a law that says I'm not allowed to broadcast, and then 14 days later I have to appear before a court and explain to them why I should be allowed to have an opinion and voice that opinion to other people. That's absolutely absurd. And any reasonable, logical person would say that that's absurd, and it's a blatant violation of constitutional rights. The whole point of a right being a right is that you don't have to justify it to anybody. You have it by default, and the only way that it can be taken away from you is if you commit some kind of crime or prove that you're not responsible with your own liberty. We can never hold this standard that the state is the one that will decide whether you are worthy to have your constitutional rights given to you. And so this whole thing is grotesque and obscene, that they are essentially putting the burden of proof on you to prove to them why you should be allowed to have a firearm. And we're going to go through a couple of the arguments here real quick on this, because this is a very clear, blatant attack on gun rights. First of all, Coleman, the sponsor of this bill, said, this is one of the issues that came up. This is a model legislation that has passed in other states. It is not a gun control bill. It is a gun safety bill. All right, well, speaking of red flags, this ought to be a pretty big one right out of the gate. Because anytime you hear the word gun safety, that is the new moniker that the left has decided they are going to use for gun control. And this came about maybe about a year ago. For example, Elizabeth Warren is now calling all of her gun control legislation gun safety. This is something that people did in the wake of the Parkland shooting, and sometimes it includes even ridiculous things like what we're hearing from Eric Swalwell, who's one of the Democrat presidential candidates, that is literally advocating for the seizing of all guns that he doesn't like, which would basically be all guns. Because he's saying all semi-automatics, that would be the vast majority of guns in the country right now. So when you hear gun safety, that's just code for gun control. They did the same thing with global warming. They decided that global warming was too hard to prove, and that they didn't like the fact that when people were talking about it being cold, there's like that was proof against global warming, so they decided to workshop the phrase, and now they call it climate change. This is just another example of Democrats trying to change the name of something without actually changing the content and hoping that people aren't smart enough to figure that out. So when they say gun safety, yes, it's a gun control bill. They can say that it's not all they want to, but this is about controlling guns of other people, so yes, it's a gun control measure. Coleman also said, this is a tool in the toolbox. 14 other states have passed this. And there are jurisdictions in this country where plastic straws are banned. Don't tell me that just because there are other places in the country that this has passed, that this is necessarily a good idea. I mean, I'm sure there are other states that have passed this. I'm sure that there's things like this in California, New York, and other blue states. So what? Doesn't make it a good idea. Whether or not it's effective is a different argument. But just because another state has passed it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. And Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense Alabama also came to support it, which is a radical anti-gun group. And they advocate for and support for gun control of just about every kind of gun control law that has come out that has been proposed. They're in favor of. They're also funded by Michael Bloomberg, he controls the biggest anti-gun lobbying group in the country, which, by the way, gives way more to political ads and way more to politicians than the NRA does. But he's a really big into the whole anti-gun movement. And so this is just another organization from that same big umbrella organization, Everytown for Gun Safety. So this is a very radical anti-gun group. There's nothing moderate about them. This is another big red flag that this bill is a bad idea. So spokesman Leontra, I believe is how to say it, Leontra Vaughn for Moms Demand Action said, quote, "My husband and I are gun owners, and I am a victim of gun violence. On New Year's Eve, 1997, my mother took her parents' gun and killed herself. If Alabama had a red flag law, it would have petitioned the court to have my grandparents' guns seized, and she would be alive today. HB 265 can prevent tragedies like this. It can also prevent mass shootings like Parkland." First of all, as tragic as suicides are, there's a lot of data that shows that getting rid of guns has no effect whatsoever on suicides, because the thing is, if you plan to kill yourself, I mean, if you have a gun, you may use the gun, but if you don't have a gun, you're going to figure out another way to kill yourself anyway. And sort of to speak to this, here's some of the countries that, even though they have way less guns and far stricter gun control than America does, because America has more guns than every other country by a lot. I'm talking many, many times that. We have actually about we actually have about as many guns as we do people. So Russia, South Korea, Ukraine, Belgium, Hungary, Japan, France, Switzerland, India, Austria, and Finland all rank higher on the suicide rate than America does. We rank 27th in the world. And so if you're looking at suicide rate, in other words, suicides per 100,000, America doesn't even come close. So the idea that guns are causing gun suicides is patently stupid. There are just as many or more people based on per capita in other countries that are killing themselves. They're just doing so with something that isn't a gun. And also, I'd like to talk about something else in this. You're telling me that based on this story, and of course, I'm so sorry that that happened to her mom, and that's a horrible thing. I've seen families have to go through suicides, and it is a nightmare no matter how the method of killing doesn't really change the fact that somebody decided to take their own life and leave their family behind, and that's a horrible thing to have to deal with. But you're really telling me that under this law, and I didn't even know that this was in the law, but this is the way that she's painting it. Are you really telling me that according to this law, that you can take somebody else's guns, that because your mother was suicidal, law enforcement would be able to rush in and take guns that didn't even belong to her, that she just had access to, that belonged to her grandparents? So let's say something horrible happened and somebody believed that somebody in my household was suicidal. Does that mean that officers would be able to strip away my right to keep and bear arms, even though I'm not even the one that may be a danger to myself or other people? Because that sounds like what she's suggesting. She said they would have taken my grandparents' guns. So you can just take away somebody else's right, even if they're not the one that may presumably be the problem? This is absolutely insane. No rational person would support something like this. And then, of course, she also says that it would prevent mass shootings like Parkland. When it came to the Parkland shooting, there was a failure of law enforcement on every single level. The FBI had 2 different tips on 2 different occasions that this guy may be a school shooter, and even had a post that specifically said that he wanted to be a school mass shooter, and did nothing about it. Local authorities came to the guy's house about 30 times, and several times would have had legal standing to remove his firearms from his possession under the current laws without a red flag law, and they didn't do it. So the thing is, it was already illegal for this guy to have his firearms. There was already legal standing for law enforcement to take away his firearms, and yet they're saying that this law should be passed because of Parkland? That doesn't make any sense. If law enforcement were doing their jobs, Parkland wouldn't have happened in the first place. You don't need a new law. You need better enforcement of the standing law. That would be like if a cop let a mugger get away and we said, okay, we need to just start arresting people before they even do the mugging. I don't even get how somebody comes up with that. But nonetheless, she was not the only one that supported this. Spokesman Karen McClure also stood up and spoke out against this. She said red flag laws are a proven way to intervene before firearm suicides or mass shootings. And her evidence, this is what she presented. McClure said that passing a red flag law in Indiana, gun suicides declined 7.5%, and after Connecticut began enforcing their red flag law, gun suicides declined by 14.7%. Now, do you notice the hat trick here? They said gun suicides decreased by this amount. Not suicides, gun suicides. It's a proven fact that there are more gun suicides in states with more guns than states with less guns. I've never disputed that. No gun advocate that I'm aware of has ever disputed that. But the point is, the suicide rate is unchanged by that. Like we just showed with other countries that don't have nearly as many guns as the United States, they still have higher suicide rates. If someone is going to commit suicide, they're going to figure out a way to do it. Not having the gun around them is not going to do anything to change that. And so when she says, well, gun suicide rates went down, yeah, but what happened to the actual suicide rate? Didn't change. So obviously, if the goal is to preserve life, then all this does is restrict the rights of gun owners and does nothing to actually prevent the deaths of these people that we're talking about. The suicide rate remains constant. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the phones on this. Let's go to line 1. Good afternoon. What's on your mind?
I guess I wanted to maybe perhaps draw a parallel here, if we may, with regard to, we know for sure that there are far more deaths from automobile accidents, and it sounds like to me that this would be more restrictive than it would be for someone that goes through the process of reckless driving and drunk driving. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
I mean, they're given more opportunity, more chances to be able to continue to drive a vehicle than they would be in the situation where they would own a gun. You know what I mean?
And owning a car and being able to drive and operate that car on public roadways isn't even a constitutional right.
It's not. No, it isn't.
mean, let's say
it's
that let's play this story out. Let's use your analogy here. Let's say that somebody alleged that you were a bad driver. No evidence, just said this guy's a bad driver and he's a danger on the roadways. So the state came by, confiscated your car, impounded it, and then had a hearing 14 days later, and you had to prove to them that you were not a bad driver. And by the way,
and you never had a wreck,
right?
Didn't have multiple speeding tickets, nothing there. They just said you were a bad driver.
Right, that's it. And then they come, they take your car, and then 14 days later, you have to show up to a court hearing and explain to them why you should be allowed to have a license. And then, even if you do prove that, you still have to pay the towing fee and the storage fee for your automobile.
That's what I was talking about. You're making my point for me.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't sound like it would be fair. People would be, pardon the pun, up in arms if it were about cars.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. And I think they will be in this state, too. I don't think this thing has a prayer of passing because of the kind of state we have, or at least I hope.
Gosh, I hope not, yeah.
I mean, I would think that would be death to the next campaign if you were to do that.
Probably
because
so.
I think even liberal people in this state, for the most part, support gun rights.
Oh,
I may be wrong on that. It's just my intuition and just observation. But I even think most people that are liberal tend to think in this state that you ought to have a right to have a gun.
Well, this is anecdotal evidence, but I got to say, because I lived in a fraternity house when I was in Auburn. I had several brothers that were very liberal, some that were actually self-proclaimed socialists, and even they believed in gun rights.
Yeah, I've seen that too. So, I mean, I don't have anything to back that up with any research that I've done per se, but I've just known liberal people that said, yeah, you ought to have a right to have a gun. I mean, even we both know somebody in common, and he's about as liberal as you can get, but he still thinks you ought to have a right to have a gun.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. This is a constitutional right. This should not be something that is controversial. For the same reason that free speech shouldn't be controversial, and the right to be safe and secure in your papers and need a warrant to go through your things, all of that stuff should be the way that we handle this.
Now, this progressive I'm talking about, too, I might add, is about to be a lawyer, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. So I don't think that there's any way that you can have any logic with this, in particular when it's pointed out in the Constitution. And as you said earlier, everyone thinks that driving a car is a birthright now. I mean, they assume that but it really isn't.
No, it's not.
It isn't the Constitution, and neither is health care, neither are a lot of other things that they have stated that are automatic rights, but they're not. But this one certainly is. There's no question about it, and it's prioritized to the nth degree, being at the top of our Constitution. So,
well, that's the thing, too. There's only one amendment that is more sacred than it, and it's the first.
Right. So I hope that it doesn't get any traction. And I don't know what the motivation behind this gentleman is that's doing this. I guess it's a man. Say Coleman, right?
It's America, so I think it may actually be a woman.
Oh, maybe a woman. Okay, well, whatever.
I'm telling you, though, she's not living up to the name. If you're named America, you ought to be very pro-gun. America, you know?
That's a good point. Well, it's been an interesting topic, to say the least, and hopefully some people can get behind this and make sure that it doesn't see the light of day and certainly doesn't pass.
Well, I hope not, but I tell you what gave me a little pause on this when I heard that there was a hearing about this thing, and there were 5 different anti-gun groups that showed up to favor the bill, and not a single person showed up to oppose the bill. Then I got a little scared.
Yeah.
And I hope that that's nothing. I hope that that's just because they, like me, didn't even know that this bill was coming up, and it kind of flew under the radar. I'm hoping that's what happened, and it's nothing to be concerned about. But if this law passes, I mean, I hate that we treat this right, out of all the rights in the Bill of Rights, we treat this as though it's a sub-right. Like it's
right.
There's the 9 rights in the Bill of Rights, and then there's also the right to keep and bear arms, which is not really a right. It's kind of a right, but not as much as the others. No, it's an amendment just like the others.
Yeah, and there's a very good reason as to why it's prioritized like that, too.
Sure.
So it's protected from the government. That's what it is.
Exactly.
So I hope that people will see this. But I'll tell you this, I could be surprised, because if Doug Jones can be elected senator, then this thing could pass, I guess.
Yeah, there's nothing that's a sure thing, and that's the reason that I think it's so important that I talk about it, because
all I know is that there are hundreds of commercials when people are running that say they're pro-gun. So I don't see how it could, but I guess stranger things have happened. So,
yeah, I got to say, if this passes, I'm tempted to just run an ad with everybody's name that voted for it.
Yeah.
All right, you have a good one. Yeah. All right, thank you so much for that. And there is actually something on the other side of this. There is a pro-gun bill that is making its way through the Senate right now. It's actually Senate Bill number 4. And Senate Bill number 4 would essentially move us, I think we would be the 14th or maybe 15th state that would become a constitutional carry state. And now this one I'm all in favor of, and essentially what it would do is that right now you have to have a permit to legally carry a gun concealed. Now, Alabama's an open carry state, so as long as the gun is clearly visible, then there's no problem. So if you want to open carry, you want to have a holster on your side or whatever, as long as the gun is clearly visible and everybody else can see that you have one, you're in the clear. You don't need a permit for that. However, when it comes to concealed carry, you actually do need a permit for that. And keep in mind that one of the things that qualifies as concealed carry in this state is having it in your automobile. So in other words, you can have a firearm, you just can't carry it around in a car unless you have a permit, which effectively means that everybody that has one that is going to carry on a regular basis pretty much needs a permit. And so because of that, there's a lot of people that buy them even if they don't use the gun very often or even carry it on their person all that often. They just have it in their car for security or even taking it to the range just so on the off chance they get pulled over on their way to the gun range or on their way to go shooting with a buddy or go hunting or something, that the police officer doesn't bust them on having a gun in their car without a permit. And because of that, there's a lot of gun owners that don't even carry every day like I do that have this concealed carry permit just for that reason alone. Well, constitutional carry, moving to being a constitutional carry state with Senate Bill 4, that would allow us to carry regardless. It would be just like open carry. You have a gun? Fine, carry it wherever you want to. We wouldn't need a permit for that. Now, you could still get a permit, and frankly, I probably would, because most states are not constitutional carry, including several of our neighboring states like Tennessee. And if I wanted to go out of state, I would want to have my Alabama permit so that I could say, see, I'm a licensed concealed carry permit holder and there's reciprocity for that, so other states will recognize my right to carry concealed. So I would probably get the permit anyway, and I know a lot of people that would too. However, because of this, because the people wouldn't need a permit for this, one of the groups that has come out against it is the Sheriff's Association. And it has nothing to do with they think that this is going to be dangerous. Now, they've said that, but as I've broken down many times, we had the same fight last year, and we talked about their opposition to the constitutional carry bill. One of the things that they continuously brought up is crime rates and everything, and when you look into it and actually look at the numbers, it was very easy to debunk every argument that they were making. None of the states that went to constitutional carry, went to permitless carry, had an uptick in violent crime or gun crime of any kind. In fact, crime rates continued to fall in each of those states. And so none of their arguments made any sense. The real reason behind this, and it's so weird to see the Alabama Sheriff's Association on the same side as Moms Demand Action for Gun Violence, Bloomberg's brainchild, one of the many organizations under that Moms Demand Action national umbrella, which is funded by Mayor Michael Bloomberg. It's weird to see them on the same side of this issue, but they are. And one of the things that we mentioned is that really what's going on here is the sheriffs really like the revenue that is brought in from permits. They really like the fact that they bring in a lot of revenue from people who have to pay the government in order to exercise their own constitutional rights. Apparently, selling a person's rights back to them is a very lucrative business. And the sheriffs know that, and that's why they don't want this constitutional carry bill to go through, because then they know it's going to cut into their funding. They know it's going to cut into that money they get from the permits. Now, I'll say this. This is not something that every sheriff agrees with just because the Sheriff's Association has taken an official stance on it. There's a lot of sheriffs that I've talked to that are actually very much in favor of this bill. And I'll also say this as well. I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. I think that it's the right thing to do, and I think that we ought to move to permitless carry. But the truth is, most people that carry on a regular basis and go out of state on a regular basis like I do, they're going to get their permit anyway. And so I don't see this being a huge drain on their funding and their revenue from the permits. I don't see this as being a big problem for them. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't foresee this causing a huge lack of funding that they're getting in from permits. There's going to be some, I imagine, but I don't think that it's going to be a huge drop. And so I think that this is much ado about nothing. And I do think that all of this is summed up in a point that I made earlier with the caller, is that I remember that in the arguments about one of the biggest Second Amendment cases in modern history, the Heller case, that you had Justice Clarence Thomas ask this question: why are we so cavalier with the Second Amendment? And Clarence Thomas is not somebody that is known for speaking up. In fact, I think it had been 10 years since he had actually said something during oral arguments, that he'd actually asked a question. And it's a good question. Why is it that we treat the Second Amendment as though it's not really part of our Bill of Rights? Why do we treat it as though the other amendments, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to be secure in your papers or not quarter soldiers or to not have your property taken away without due process of law? So, by the way, this bill that we're talking about in Alabama, there's actually several constitutional amendments it would violate, not just the second, even though I know the states aren't beholden to the constitutional amendments. I'm saying in principle, there are several reasons why this bill is a bad idea and would inhibit your liberty. I'm just saying that why is it that we treat the Second Amendment as though it's something that we can just sort of write off and treat it as though it's not really a human right? Why is it unique among them? I think it does come from a very difference in worldview, a very big difference in worldview. You see, to the right, and people that are advocates for the Second Amendment, the way we think about it is, this is a human right, so if we're going to even think about taking it away from somebody, we need to be dead sure that they cannot be trusted with this liberty, because we don't want to take it away from anybody that we don't have to. And I think that that is the correct mentality. You see, people on the left sort of think about it the opposite way, because they don't really think about it as a real human right. In fact, I had a fraternity brother one time, good guy, smart guy, somebody that I really like and admire. We were talking about what happened with the New Zealand shooting, and I mentioned that it was wrong for them to violate the human rights of their citizens. And he said, well, I would consider it an American right, and this is not a guy who's anti-Second Amendment. He said, I would consider it an American right, and I would say that this was wrong if they were doing it in America, but can we really say it's a human right? Yes, we can, because of the right to self-defense, and I won't get into everything that I said in that particular response to that, because I've done so much on the Second Amendment. You can look all this up on my YouTube channel if you want to. But the point is, there is a sentiment out there that even though freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press, those are all human rights, and then there's just kind of this weird, hokey old right that was thrown in there with the right to keep and bear arms. It's just as much a human right as the others are. And it's wrong when any government, American or otherwise, violates it. You see, to the left, they think, well, guns are really scary and dangerous, and so we ought to, if there's even the slightest hint of maybe they might do something in the future that could hurt somebody else with their guns, we ought to just take them away just in case. That's not the way a right works. And what Justice Thomas's point was, is that you can't have this, pun intended, you can't have this right on a hair trigger that anybody just kind of steps a toe out of line and your first reaction is to take away their Second Amendment rights. That's not the way that this works. It's not the way that it should work. You see, when it comes to rights, it's always wise to err on the side of liberty. That you never even consider removing somebody's rights unless you see no other alternative and you absolutely have to. There are some situations where I understand that. I'm actually in favor of violent criminal offenders that have actually been convicted of not having their Second Amendment rights, at least for a time. But this idea that we ought to be preemptively removing a person's constitutional rights from them before they even commit a crime, before there has even been a court proceeding to determine whether they're guilty or innocent, and then that person has to prove to a court that they should have their rights, that's not the way a right works. A right is you have it by default, automatically. And if anybody wants to take it away, they have to prove that there is no other choice, that there is no other option, that the government has to take it away because there is no other alternative left. that other people would be in literal danger, and the burden of proof is on them to prove that you are a danger, not on you to prove you're not. This is a horrible bill, and it should fail, and fail miserably in the state, and I hope that it does. And anybody that votes in favor of this, I know that this probably doesn't mean much to a lot of the representatives, but you don't have a prayer of ever getting my vote again if you vote in favor of this bill, because it shows a complete lack of respect for the liberties of the citizens of the state of Alabama. We're going to go to a break, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Abby Johnson is in the other room.
Here.
Our first order of business is to present Planned Parenthood's Employee of the Year Award. Abby Johnson.
This is Abby. She's our newest volunteer escort. Abby, this is Cheryl's Alessandro.
I'd be the youngest director in Planned Parenthood history.
You'll actually be in charge of the abortions at your clinic?
I have a chance to make a real difference.
No matter what you do for the rest of your life, you're still gonna be a baby killer.
The only thing that's changed is you, Abby. Can you even hear yourself talk right now about these procedures? These are little babies.
I'm not going to apologize for doing a job that helps women in crisis.
There's still a part of me that isn't sure.
I know. But the one thing that all experts agree on is that at this stage, the fetus can't feel anything.
Sorry to bother you, but they need an extra person in the back room. Are you free? I saw it. It was like it was twisting and fighting for its life.
We commend the souls of these hundreds of children. And Lord, we pray to end abortion.
I really appreciate what you've done for us. I'll not forget it.
22,000 abortions. How do I even comprehend that?
Rough day at the office?
You can say that. It's your dad and me. You are our baby from the moment of conception.
We are paying you to be a perfect instrument of corporate policy. We are an abortion provider.
I can't be a part of this anymore. Everything that they told us is a lie.
Don't underestimate the repercussions of this. You gotta be careful.
Rhonda, please don't do this! Rhonda!
Let me tell you what's going to happen if you walk through that door.
Congratulations. You've made an enemy of one of the most powerful organizations on the planet.
Just a reminder that those ads are from Unplanned, the movie. They're not paid ads. They're just something that I'm doing to kind of help them out. So be sure to go and see Unplanned. It's already made a lot of money. It's already been a success, much larger than they thought it would. It's actually added theaters after its opening weekend. It's playing in more theaters this past weekend than it was opening weekend, which just never happens. So be sure to do that. Go out, see it. If you've got nothing to do this weekend, you haven't seen it yet, please go out and see it. It's a very important movie, and it's a movie that a lot of people may be afraid because of the graphic nature or because they're afraid that it's going to be a drag. It's really not. It has a triumphant ending. It's a really good story. So even though there's some parts that, yeah, if you watch it, they're kind of rough, they're kind of hard to watch, and you kind of squirm a little bit. I mean, that's part of it, sure. But overall, it's just a great movie, and if you haven't seen it yet, you really need to. So be sure to go out and see it this weekend if you have not done so thus far. So I wanted to talk about something else that's been going on. Even though we didn't have a lot of chance to talk about this earlier this week because I had a couple of shows that I had to cut short for scheduling reasons, it really bothers me that one theme that seems to have happened a lot this week is that we've moved to this weird place where now all criticism is racism. And this has really been true for a while. I don't think that this is necessarily a new phenomenon, but I think that it's getting a lot more press, and there are a lot more people that adhere to this idea that if you criticize anybody that is of a minority status, then the only possible explanation for that is not that you think that they're incorrect or you think that they're maybe even misguided, that you actually hate people of a minority if you criticize anybody of a minority. And this was on display earlier this week with Ilhan Omar. And of course, for those of you who may not remember, she's the Muslim representative in the House. She's the one that wears a hijab, very devout Muslim. And people have now misconstrued any criticism of her as racism and Islamophobia. For example, Ilhan Omar earlier dismissively referred to 9/11 as, quote, some people did something. And this is something that she has a record of doing. There was a clip that surfaced not long ago about her complaining to one of her professors. She says, you know, when I had a terrorism class in college, and it was studying the history of terrorism, and whenever this professor would say Taliban or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram, there was this intensity and sort of this ominous tone that he took, and he didn't do the same with America or England or some of these other countries. So essentially what she was doing was she was equating America and equating England to groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and Hamas, which is completely unconscionable, but she sees them somehow as moral equivalents to terrorist organizations. And let's also remember that when she's saying this, she was sort of justifying CARE, which, by the way, she got her facts wrong on that. We actually discussed that, I think, last week on the show when she said this, that when she brought up that CARE was founded in the wake of 9/11 because there were people losing their civil rights. That's not true. It was founded back in the 90s, way before 9/11 ever happened, so she's got her facts wrong on that, even though she used to work for CARE. But nonetheless, she sort of dismissively referred to 9/11 as just, well, some people did something, writing off the deaths of nearly 3,000 Americans. And because she has a track record of doing this, and because of sort of the dismissive way that she was describing it, that's the reason that people took offense to it, and I think that they were right to do so. But in response to this, President Donald Trump actually put out a video to sort of showcase the dismissive nature of the way that she said it. And so here's the clip that the president actually tweeted out and pinned it on the top of his Twitter feed.
In congressional hearings, the minority party gets to select its own
Okay,
witnesses.
yeah, well, that's not it.
And of all the people that Republicans could have selected,
I don't know
they picked Candace Owens.
That's not it.
Can you set the record straight when it comes to the Politico interview? I just want to get your side of the story.
Okay, well, I'm not really sure what's going on here. My computer, unfortunately, is failing me. Somehow that wound up not getting in the way that it was supposed to.
CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something.
So you have no idea right now?
There's another one. Another plane just hit.
Some people did something.
Oh my goodness, there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon.
Some people did something.
It just flew straight into it.
So that's the clip, and as you can see, it's just Ilhan Omar saying some people did something using her own words, and then interspersing that with news clips of the event that she was describing. That's all it was. That's the entire video. You saw it. And so, despite this, the left completely flipped out about it and accused Trump of inciting violence against her and all this other crazy stuff, saying that what Trump was doing there, and they weren't even moving to the point, there were a lot of people on the left saying that because Ilhan Omar received an increase in death threats after this, and she claims, and I don't know if this is true or not, I take everything that she says with a grain of salt, but she claims that it was specifically the video that they were referencing when these death threats were received. So here's one thing that we need to get out on the table before any of this happens, and it's insane that we even live in a society where I have to say this because no rational person would believe that I advocate for this anyway. But of course, death threats to anybody for any reason are wrong. Obviously. These people, these nutcases that no matter how despicable what Ilhan Omar said was, and it was, threatening her life is not an appropriate response to that. However, the increase to death threats is not the fault of Donald Trump. And in this particular video, Donald Trump isn't even giving commentary. All he is doing is showing her speaking in her own words and interspersing that with news clips of the event to which she is referencing, and showing a contrast there with the way that she dismissed it and the seriousness of the event itself. That's it. You don't even hear Donald Trump's voice. You don't even see him giving commentary. And yet, they're saying that this is what incited violence, and some members of Congress, including, stupidly enough, yeah, you guessed it, it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez even went a step further and said that he was intentionally citing violence. So not just that the president said something irresponsible and these death threats cropped up as a direct result of what he was doing, she also adds intent, saying that he directly was trying to bring up violence, that he was intentionally trying to get people to threaten Ilhan Omar, which is even a bridge further. But here's the thing. I'm not saying that the death threats in any way are justified or that they're okay, but if just Ilhan Omar's words and a video of that is what's inspiring the death threats, as incorrect a response to that as that is, isn't Ilhan Omar kind of inciting violence against herself? Isn't that what's actually happening here? Because you're saying the words are violence, the words, the actual speech, is the problem. Well, if the speech is the problem, and the only speech in the video is Ilhan Omar, isn't she the one inciting violence against herself? Again, I don't think she actually is inciting violence. I don't. Because I don't believe that words are violence. I don't believe that word is speech. She's not calling for violence, but neither is Donald Trump. And so we've got to get out of this idea that because people disagree, or because people say something stupid and someone reacts to that, I would say appropriately, when it comes to Donald Trump, by putting together a video showing the serious nature of what she was sort of dismissively talking about as some people doing something. That when you're looking at this, we have to get out of this mindset that speech alone is violence. Some people react incorrectly to speech, but just because a person acts incorrectly to speech does not make the speech itself the problem. Case in point, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and just about to my knowledge, everybody that is running for president on the Democrat side has said that Republicans are the reason that the globe is going to be a giant fireball in 12 years because of global warming or whatever. And they're saying that it's the Republicans that are causing all this. And when the world implodes, that something horrible is going to happen. In fact, a Bernie Sanders supporter tried to murder a large portion of Congress on a softball field. Are we saying that their rhetoric on things like global warming, that those are inciting of violence and that those words ought to be blamed for the actions of crazy people? No. I said that the day that it happened. I was angry. But the day that it happened, I still said and still had the good sense to say, but this isn't Bernie Sanders' fault. Even though we found out this guy was an actual Bernie Sanders supporter, and not just a supporter, a volunteer of his campaign. Bernie Sanders' speech is still not the problem. I think his speech is wrong. I think his ideas are bad. But I don't think that Bernie Sanders was literally calling for violence. And unless he did that, there's no crime. Unless he did that, there's no incitement of violence. There's no legal standard for that. I mean, Bernie Sanders can spout off whatever nonsense about the environment that he wants to. And it's still not violence. Incorrect, and I'll argue with him about it. But we still don't hold that to the standard of anything that a crazy person that happens to like the things that you say does is now attributed to you and you're the real cause of the problem. We don't do that in this country. And to suggest that we ought to do that in this country is inherently un-American, because it strikes at the very core of our belief in freedom of speech. That speech is not violence, and you ought to be able to say whatever you want, as long as you don't injure somebody in the process or call for somebody else to injure them in the process. Unless violence actually follows, the speech itself ought not be prosecuted. That's a standard that we ought to hold to, and it's a value that we used to have. There used to be a sense of, especially amongst the left, even in the 60s, even then they would say, well, I may not like that people are saying things that I don't agree with, but I still think that the First Amendment is a good thing and that we do uphold this value of freedom of speech no matter what. Now the left has done the exact opposite. They've asked for a safe space to where they don't have to hear anything. And here's another thing, too, that I wanted to bring up. Ilhan Omar specifically said this: "Since the president's tweet Friday evening, I have experienced an increase in direct threats on my life, many directly referencing or replying to the president's video." And yet, she's saying that the video itself is the problem, and that's violent, and that's a bridge too far, and because of that, the president has essentially overstepped the line, and that he's the cause of the death threats. But it seems as though Ilhan Omar forgets what she actually said about Donald Trump himself. Take a listen.
Quick question. Can you set the record straight when it comes to the Politico interview? I just want to get your side of the story. Do you believe that Trump and Obama are the same, just different when it comes to their polishedness? We understand that you refute this Politico story. Could you just set the record straight so we get your side of it? Do you think that President Obama is the same as President Trump?
Absolutely not. That is silly to even think and equate the two. One is human, the other is real.
Is it true that you just think that he's more polished than Trump?
I mean, there you have it. Ilhan Omar is saying it's silly to even compare President Obama and President Trump. One is human, the other is not. So, apparently, Donald Trump playing a video of her own words, interspersed with footage of a news event that was happening that she was referencing in the clip where she's talking about it, that's a bridge too far, that's inciting violence, and that needs to be removed immediately. Ilhan Omar referring to Donald Trump as not a human being, that's fine, and that's not inciting violence, and there's no way that anybody could construe that as something that would be justifying of violence. Now, again, she wasn't calling for violence in that clip, and as despicable as what she said was, still freedom of speech. She still has the right to say it. But she does not afford that same privilege, that same inhuman or inborn human right to other people. She thinks that speech that she doesn't agree with, well, that ought to be removed, because that's just a bridge too far. Her saying that someone is not human apparently does not qualify for that. And so, of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went after that, and now she's even calling for the boycott of the New York Post. And the reason being here is that the New York Post, in reference to this, put out this as their cover, and it was talking about this is their "some people did something." So, because of this, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has actually called for the boycotting of the New York Post and for people to not buy it. Again, what's so hilarious here is the double standard. Now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is well within her rights as an American citizen to call for a boycott of a company she doesn't like. By that same extension, the New York Post is also, as American citizens, they're allowed to put out that picture of 9/11 and put out that quote by Ilhan Omar. But the irony in all of this is that the left constantly berates President Trump for being anti-press and his attacks on the media, which, by the way, sometimes are justified. Sometimes I think he goes too far, says things that are unhelpful, and I don't think that calling, for example, the media the enemy of the people, I don't think that that's a necessarily very productive way to conduct yourself. That's something that I've been critical of the president of too. And I don't like the way he talks about the media from time to time. However, what's hilarious to me is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who constantly cites this as Trump being against the First Amendment and against freedom of the press, when she calls for a boycott of speech that she doesn't like, that's not an attack on the media. That's not an attack on the press. Even though they're using a direct quote from Ilhan Omar to make their point. They're not even editorializing. They're just saying, this is what she said. Here's a picture of 9/11. And yet somehow this, in her own mind, is not an attack on the press, well, because they're conservatives, and it doesn't really matter what happens to them. I'm so disheartened by the fact that in this country we've gotten to a point to where we're perfectly fine with rights being taken away of people on quote-unquote the other side. And sometimes conservatives are this way too. I hate to say it, but they are. Sometimes conservatives take this double standard that they don't want speech eliminated, but they do want speech eliminated for some things. I mean, come on. Some things are just, offensive and wrong. No, freedom of speech, you got to be absolute on that. You got to extend that to both sides. I think the left is far worse on that, and there's far more people on the left that are willing to violate freedom of speech for other people. But the point is, regardless of why or how or what side you happen to fall on, we've got to get back to a place to where we respect the rights of other people, especially when it comes to freedom of speech. Cory Booker trying to outdo the stupidity of the people in his party and, succeeding in many cases. He also tried to jump in on this. He said, nothing she said, talking about Ilhan Omar, nothing she said is deserving of what's happening to her and what the president is doing to her. This is a reprehensible attack on her. It's trying to incite anti-Islamic feelings and divide Americans. And we should all rally to fellow American Congresswoman's defense right now against a president that seems to have a disgusting and, in my opinion, desire to continue to attack especially African Americans, whether they are football players or a congressperson. Okay, so right before we even get into the actual content of what he's saying, I always find it funny when people accuse President Trump of just hate-mongering a certain group of people. Because whether you like the guy or hate him, he's an equal opportunity offender. The guy offends everybody from time to time. He doesn't care if you're white, black, green, blue, purple, whatever. If you say something that he thinks is stupid or he sees as an attack on him, he's going to punch back. I mean, he does it with Elizabeth Warren. He does it with Joe Biden. He does it with Beto O'Rourke. He does it with... It doesn't matter. If you're opposed to him, he's opposed to you. Now, sometimes he's opposed to somebody for reasons I don't completely understand, but the point is, it doesn't seem, based on any observation, that race has anything to do with it. And this idea that he's specifically targeting African Americans, that's just stupid. But nonetheless, the problem with this is that Booker sees bigotry in absolutely everything. I mean, if the guy's power goes out in a storm, he assumes that somehow racism is connected to it. That's sort of Cory Booker's shtick and always has been. And keep in mind, this is the same guy that tried to make Jeff Sessions out to be a closet Klan member, even though he's the guy that bankrupted the Klan in the state of Alabama. That's Cory Booker, the guy that tried to make the case that Jeff Sessions was really secretly a Klan member and really secretly hated black people because of a joke that he made 30 years ago, which was really more of a joke on marijuana than the Klan anyway, and ignored the fact that he is the guy, as Alabama's Attorney General, that made sure the Klan went completely bankrupt. Yeah, but somehow he's really a closet Klan member. Cory Booker's a joke. There's no chance that this guy actually winds up getting the nomination. I mean, even if there wasn't such a crowd in the Democrat primary, this guy has no chance. This guy's an absolute joke. There are other Democrats that actually are pretty good at playing politics and are pretty smart about it. Cory Booker is not among them. He's down there with the Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the Hillary Clintons of the world. His elevator doesn't quite reach the top. But nonetheless, that's what the guy said. Rashida Tlaib, another Muslim member of the Congress, she also went after him and claims that, but here's the funny thing about it. When she responded, she was upset with Trump, but she also had some choice words for Nancy Pelosi. And what she said to Nancy Pelosi, because Nancy Pelosi didn't come out strongly enough, even though she actually did go pretty strongly against President Trump. She said that Nancy Pelosi didn't go strongly enough against Trump because of what he said and what he tweeted out about Ilhan Omar. And so she said that the Muslims in Congress were just being used as tokens and Nancy Pelosi doesn't really care about them. They just want to check off a list. Which, you know how every once in a while a blind squirrel finds a nut? I think that's what happened here, that Rashida Tlaib. I mean, she's not wrong. That's essentially what the Democrats want, is they just want to be able to check off every box. And I don't think that they're particularly concerned with the Muslims or any demographic personally, as long as they're allowed to keep holding on to their power. And I think that Rashida Tlaib actually sort of accidentally hit the nail on the head with that one. But Tlaib is specifically calling for Pelosi to say that that was an incitement of violence, which was not true. But the truth is, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. The left has been claiming this for a very long time. I can remember, even though I'm only 29, I'm old enough to remember when President Barack Obama was the president of the United States, and there were multiple people that came out and said, if you didn't vote for Barack Obama, it's because you were a racist. If you did not vote for him, it's because you hate black people. Now, I don't really understand how they explained the minorities that even though they were few, there were at least some that voted for the other candidate. But nonetheless, that's how they explained it, that the only reason, because Barack Obama was just so perfect and awesome, and there was nothing to not like about him, the guy really should have won unanimously. Not a single vote should have gone to either Romney or McCain in either election. And if you voted against him either time, it was because you're really a racist. I can't tell you the number of times I heard that. Sometimes it was through insinuation, and sometimes they just flat out said it. But either way, that was the assumption, that if you didn't vote for Barack Obama, it was because you were really a racist. If you didn't side with Mike Brown, even though none of the forensic evidence backed up his story there in Ferguson, in the fiasco that followed with that, then it was really because you were a racist. You see, we have gotten to the point that any criticism of any minority person, regardless of how legitimate it is considered racism by at least a large plurality of those on the left. And what's so sad is that it's the exact opposite of what Martin Luther King talked about. The standard that he wanted was to judge people based on the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people on the left that would far rather judge people on the color of their skin, and are doing that, rather than their merit or the content of their character. And the truth is, if I were a minority person, I would be furious at this. This idea that I shouldn't be opened up to criticism because of my status as a minority person, because I'm, I guess, too fragile or wouldn't be able to stand up to the criticism. Part of the reason that I do this every day, part of the reason that I'm a talk show host, and part of the reason I don't mind talking to anybody about this stuff is because I believe in my ideas. And I believe in my character. And I believe that it will stand up to adversity, that it will stand up to challenges. Because I have faith in it, and because I think that I'm right. Because I think my ideas are good. And I don't mind standing up to the scrutiny because of that. What a lot of this conversation becomes, and a lot of times when people are accusing others of racism, at least in this context, what they're really trying to do is shut down speech. What they're really trying to do is put you on the defensive and hope that you're so busy defending and trying to convince people that you're not a racist that they'll forget about the idea that you were proclaiming. But if you have good ideas, you don't do stuff like that, because you believe the ideas will stand up for themselves. You believe that they can stand up to the scrutiny. That when tested with a trial by fire, that your ideas will be fine. And I'm so disappointed that there are Democrats that try to convince people that as a minority person, you shouldn't have to answer for your own ideas. Just say, hey, well, I'm a minority person and you're a racist if you disagree with me. No, if you have bad ideas, then those ideas should go away. If I have a criticism of somebody, it shouldn't matter what the color of their skin is. And legitimate criticism is something that helps all of us. It helps me. I love it when people call in and disagree with me, because having to defend my own ideas solidifies my belief in them and sometimes points out where my arguments are weak. And so it makes me a better person and a better host because of that. We can't be afraid of criticism, and we cannot become our own human shield to where we are just immune to criticism of any kind unless it's something that comports with our worldview. That being said, let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Daniel, and just to get you caught up on where we are, because we've been doing a series on Daniel for a while now, you may recall that the other day that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and Daniel went to interpret that dream, but Daniel's a little afraid because he knows the king is not going to like his answer. Well, here we finally have the translation of that dream in Daniel chapter 4, verses 30 through 33. And here it says, this is sort of the fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, because you remember what we talked about the other day, is that Nebuchadnezzar's dream was that he was this big tree, and that tree was going to be cut down, and the tree was Nebuchadnezzar, and that's how Daniel interpreted it. Well, unfortunately, he didn't repent of his sin, and this did come to pass in Daniel 4, 30 through 33. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I have myself built as a royal residence, by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven, saying, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whomever he wishes." Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until the hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. It's a really sad thing, but pride is one of the most deadly sins that mankind faces. Honestly, it's the one that I feel that I struggle with the most. I remember that C.S. Lewis wrote one time, and he was involved in several correspondence with several different people, and luckily we have a lot of those letters preserved. C.S. Lewis was talking to somebody that was struggling with the sin, and he was struggling with the sin of lust. And C.S. Lewis talked about his own struggles with the sin of pride. And he said, "If I had to choose between the two, I would much rather have your struggle than mine." And the reason is, pride is the deadliest of all sins. Keep in mind that it is the reason that the devil became the devil. It was his arrogance and his desire to be like God and to be higher than God that led him down the path of rebellion. And Lewis is not wrong in that. I don't know if it's really the greatest of all sins or anything like that, but I do know it's one that I personally struggle with, and it's one that Nebuchadnezzar really struggled with in this passage. You see, a godly man looks around and sees all creation, even things built by human hands, and remembers that at its origin is God. God not only provided, for example, if we were to look around this room, the wood and the raw materials to build this, but he also instilled the builders with wisdom and craftsmanship. All their talents, all the genius of mankind originates from God. And so looking at any marvel, even one that's man-made, even one that was a great nation like Babylon, a humble man, and a man that thinks of things the way that God thinks of things, looks at the world through heaven's eyes, realizes that everything ultimately is God's creation, and that he ought to be given glory for all of it. See, if Nebuchadnezzar had just changed his perspective a little bit, if all he had done is look around his great nation and the wealth that he had amassed, and said, wow, God has blessed me so much. God has done so much good for me. Look at all these amazing things that God has done. Look at how he has blessed me and blessed my kingdom and kept us safe and given us wealth. And look at the technology we've been able to develop. You see, he could have still marveled in all of the things that he was marveling at. All he had to do was put the emphasis on God and show a little bit of gratitude, and he would have been just fine. But unfortunately, he didn't. Unfortunately, he focused inwardly. Unfortunately, he thought that it was really a testament to him how great his nation was. And God, in his own way, decided to correct that error. And the way that he did it is to humble him more than Nebuchadnezzar had ever been humbled in his life. And the reason that he did so is so that he would have an appreciation for God and for the things that he has done for him. And you'll notice the language in the last part of that verse, that it talks about how everything under the sun is really to God's glory, not man's. You see, I think the reason that the punishment fits the crime here is because Nebuchadnezzar essentially got to experience life, what it would be like in a completely godless state. Now, follow me on this. Even though animals, of course, are God's creation as well, they do not have a soul, and they do not have that spark of the divine. They're not made in the image of God the way mankind is. So what happens to Nebuchadnezzar? He becomes like a beast. He essentially begins to live life like an animal. He gets to experience what life would be like without God, and sadly what he would be like without God. Because our ability to reason and speak and to acquire knowledge and apply that knowledge in a certain way, to learn from our mistakes, to do self-reflection, all of those things are aspects that God has and that he imparts with us as a blessing. And without those things, we're just animals. Without God, without that spark of the divine living inside of us, we would all be just as feral and cruel and really ordinary as any animal would be. Just gathering food wherever we can, never thinking past really the next minute, and living based off of our own primal instincts. You see, God had to show Nebuchadnezzar in a very real way what life without God is really like. And if we want to live a godly life, we have to look at the world through heaven's eyes and acknowledge God's glory and show some gratitude for the things that he's given to us. Because without him, really, even if we look like people and talk like people and act like people, at the end of the day, without God, we're really just beasts of the field. We owe everything to him. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.